Hello, everybody. Welcome to season 8 of the Beyond the Business Suit podcast, the podcast that helps you to awaken to your purpose, your presence, and your potential. My name is Kylie Carr. I am the host of the Beyond the Business Suit podcast, and I'm thrilled to be with all of you today. I've been looking forward to this conversation for quite some time now, as our guest is someone that I've known for a while. So let me tell you about our guest. Our guest today is Suneel Gupta. Suneel lost his Dharma and then discovered it again. As an author and visiting scholar at the Harvard Medical School, Suneel studies the most extraordinary people on the planet to discover and share simple, actionable habits to lift our performance and deepen our daily sense of purpose. Let me tell you about some of the hats Suneel has worn. Author, speechwriter, startup founder, professor, researcher, politician, public servant, husband, father, brother, son, and I know a friend to many. His work has been featured by many major outlets, including CNBC, TED, and the New York Times. I personally have known Suneel for over 10 years. We were just catching up on how long it's been, but we met when we were classmates at the Kellogg School of Management, and it has been so amazing to see his trajectory and how his life has evolved over time. And even back then, it was clear that Suneel was someone who was deep, purpose-filled, conscious, and thoughtful. So, Suneel, welcome to Beyond the Business Suit.
Kylie, it's good to see you again. That's like one of the warmest intros anybody's ever given me. Thank you very much.
I am honored. I am honored. Let me tell you, this book, Everyday Dharma, has really penetrated my soul so deeply. I read a lot. I listen to a lot of audiobooks, and self-development is my jam. And although I know that the classification for this book is not necessarily self-development, that's where I'm going to put it in. That's the category I'm going to put it in. And
Sure.
it's by far the best one I've read all year long, hands down.
Thank
So you're welcome. And I'm not saying that because I adore you and we've known each other for a long time, but also because it's true. And I hope so many people watching and listening read the book. So I'm excited to get started. And if anybody is watching us on LinkedIn Live right now, please put in the chat where you are watching us and joining us from. That's always great to see. And if you have any questions throughout, please feel free to put them in the chat and we will do our best to answer those. But let's start, Suneel, with what inspired you to write Everyday Dharma?
Yeah. Well, so Dharma is your inner calling, right? It is my grandfather called this your essence. And when you're expressing that essence, you come alive in a brand new way. You feel confident, you feel creative. And when you don't, you feel lost, you feel depleted. And I think so many of us are feeling that way right now. And I know that I certainly was around the time that I started to kind of come back to this idea of Dharma. As I mentioned, I learned it as a kid. I was on a porch in New Delhi when my grandfather first kind of talked to me about Dharma. But, as an Indian kid growing up in the United States, I pretty much did everything I could to distance myself from anything that sort of felt Indian, that felt Eastern. I would, I'm ashamed to admit it, but I guess I already talk about this a little bit in the book, but I would cake baby powder onto my face to make myself look more white and to blend into the school district that I was in. I went to school in suburban Detroit. And, I guess I wasn't proud of who I was. But when I got to this point where, I felt like, hey, I feel like I'm following the formula. And I feel like to a certain degree, I'm hitting, certain goals. But I don't feel any happier as a result. In fact, I feel more empty and I feel like I'm burning out and I feel depressed. And what's the answer to that? That's when I started to come back to this way of Dharma. And Dharma has existed for, it's existed for over a millennia, and it's been passed down from generation to generation, from east to west. My fascination was, all right, what does this timeless body of wisdom, how do we apply it today? In today's fast-paced world where everything is changing so quickly, AI, automation, things speeding up. How do we start to take this thing that has helped so many people discover a sense of meaning in their life and use it today?
Ooh, there's so much there. I can imagine how it must have been, and you described it so vividly in the book, being a brown boy in Michigan with a lot of people around you who did not look like you. And I had a similar experience being a brown girl going
Yeah.
in many different spaces. I recalled as I was reading that being in Littleton, Colorado, and there were two of us
Yes.
in the seventh grade class. And at the end of the year, they gave us, I got the best singer and he got the best dancer award. And listening or thinking back, I was thinking, oh my goodness, wow, like the microaggressions there.
Yeah.
But it's tough to not see yourself represented. And we do all we can as kids to make sense of that and to try to fit in.
Yeah.
So I love how you brought that into it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, my mom was a refugee. She sort of was on when India and Pakistan split into two different countries. She was on the other side of the border. And so she ended up sort of fleeing to the India, what became just the India side of the border from what is today Pakistan. And, I think the thing that I learned from her about her story as a refugee was that there was this constant sense of impermanence. There was constant sense of kind of you're an outsider, right? And it never really goes away. Even though they were in Detroit for over 30 years, both she and my father working as automotive engineers, there was still a sense of kind of like we are kind of like not the ones who totally belong, right? And sort of making sense of that. And I think I don't know if this was your experience, Callie, but I think there were those who, when that happens, I think there's a decision that you make. One path is to stand out, right? And to just own it and be proud of it, right? And that's this path I wish I would have taken. But the other path is to do everything you possibly can to fit in, right? But the thing about that path is that oftentimes you're still not fitting in, right? To me, I was kind of deluding myself as the brown guy who was like over wearing Bruce Springsteen t-shirts, it's like I'm like, who am I kidding? I still don't totally belong here, right? And so it took me a while longer than I hope it takes my kids to really stand into like step into who they are, right? And to start to kind of own some of that individuality. In some ways, my parents and I spoke about this book, and I didn't intend to say this to my mom, but the other day I did. I said, in some ways, I hope that this book can sort of be a little bit of an apology as well for the way that I behaved, for sort of rebelling so much against what you had taught me. Because when I started to kind of put these practices into place, it changed everything for me, right? It really did. And what I was shocked about with the book and sort of going into the research of Dharma is how it has changed the lives of people, not just from the East, but in the West, from Toni Morrison to Jimi Hendrix to Dr. King and so many others that were able to sort of bring the practices of Dharma into their lives. And when they did, were able to sort of find their, as I put in the book, find their way back to who they were so they could express that fully.
So good. So good. One of my favorite stories was one that you shared about Dr. King that some people may find unexpected. So can you share? Do you know the story I'm talking
Yeah,
about?
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the story about Dr. King really comes into a chapter called Kriya. And Kriya is all about sort of how we take action, right? Because it's one thing to know your purpose in life or have a sense of what that is, and it's quite another thing to act on it. And one of the ideas that I wanted to dispel with is that the way we take action in our lives is that we wait for enough courage. We summon up enough courage and then we take action. And I think that's sort of the way that we've kind of been conditioned to believe is that you have to sort of, almost muster up enough bravery and then you do something about it. But the more I dig into stories of people who were able to change the world around them, the more I realize it was actually the other way around. They didn't wait for courage in order to take action. They took action and then they let courage catch up along the way. And as you look at sort of figures that we now say those were courageous individuals, what we start to realize is no, actually, they were pretty scared as well. And I think Dr. King is a great example of that. And so the story in this chapter is really told through the eyes of Marion Edelman, great civil rights leader who was a mentee of Dr. King's. And one of the experiences that she shares is how she saw him as a student when she was at Spelman College. And, at that point in time, Dr. King, I mean, it's crazy how young he was when he really stepped into his role, right? We're talking about a 20 something, right? Like if he was he would be Gen Z today, right? That's when he gave his I Have a Dream speech. He would have been a Gen Zer up at that podium, which is insane, right? Given the amount of sort of weight and responsibility that he had on his shoulders. When Marian Edelman describes her experience at Spelman College, she was expecting to sort of walk into this talk that he was giving and seeing a man at the podium who was thunderous and full of conviction and full of confidence. And what she saw was exactly the opposite. She saw somebody who was fairly timid, fairly shy, but most notably did not have a roadmap for what was ahead. What she was kind of expecting is somebody who was going to say, this is how we win. This is how we move forward. These are our marching orders. And instead, she saw somebody who was like, look, I'm trying to figure this out as I go, right? And, while you might think that a story like that, or I certainly thought a story like that would be deflating, it was actually very inspiring for her and for the people who were in that chapel that day watching Dr. King speak. And here's why. When we can see leaders that we admire as not necessarily being these bastions of courage, of not necessarily being these bastions of bravery, that is when it starts to become more inclusive for us. We start to feel like, hey, even if I don't feel full of conviction right now, even if I'm scared about that goal that I want to go get, that dream that I have in my mind, knowing that the other people that we look to as courageous leaders were scared as well starts to make this much more palatable for us. So, when Dr. King was murdered, Marian Edelman talks about this moment where, she and many others who were part of sort of that core group were able to go on. They were able to continue doing what they were doing, even though they were scared, because they had seen the formula through Dr. King of you don't wait for courage in order to take action. You take action and you let courage catch up along the way.
Yes, yes. And I love how that recognition of him being scared too in the face of that, the weight of all of that humanized him. And it also showed me, and what it brought up for me as well, is when we connect with our Dharma, when we connect with the essence and the life force within us, it opens up things for other people. It's not just for us.
Yeah.
It's so expansive. And so Marian Edelman was able to step into hers
Yeah.
because of him stepping into his courageously.
I think it's such a good point too, Callie, and I think it's a good example, by the way, of like how I see you, is that just by living your dharma, just by starting to express your essence to the world, you naturally start to rub off on other people. People will notice, they will see you doing your thing. Like one of the most inspiring stories in the book for me was my buddy Rich, who is a Trader Joe's. He works at Trader Joe's today. He's worked at Trader Joe's for the past 20 years. Rich is an artist, and he, after college went to Florence and he started to paint. And he had an internship out there. He developed an apprenticeship, and he was sort of living the life, right? I mean, I was working in this large technology consulting firm, and here was my buddy Rich, who was like living the dream, painting in piazzas, like mixing with global artisans. But then his mom got sick, and she went in for a pretty minor procedure, and the procedure went wrong, and she fell into a coma. And so he gets called back to Detroit, where we were living, to basically become her primary caretaker. His father had long passed, and he was the one. And so all of a sudden, his life completely shifted from this just artisan dream life to now he was working at Trader Joe's. He was stocking shelves. He did that to pay to pay for their for her care. And for him, though, he never sort of gave up on his Dharma. Like he never stopped painting. He always found space to do that. Eventually converted a garage that he had from a house that he had sort of built, he had bought for him and his mom in outer Detroit. He converted the garage into an art studio where he would start to train students. And to this day, he still works at Trader Joe's, right? And I think that, like, for me, it's stories like Rich's that are the real inspiration, because we can always point to, I think, the headliners, and we can always point to the icons, and there's some really amazing untold stories out there, which I think the book really kind of encapsulates, like things I didn't know about people like Mahatma Gandhi, things I didn't know about Hank Aaron. But at the same time, I think what really sort of to me was special about the book was a story about the assembly line workers. It was the nurses, it was the everyday accountants, it was the people who in some ways felt trapped in their life. They felt like they had walked a path that didn't quite feel like theirs, and without abandoning their life, they were able to find their way back, right? Because I think that's sometimes the myth, is that purpose is the kind of thing that is only available if you have enough time and you have enough space, and maybe even enough savings, right? But for the rest of us, that you and I both have kids, we have responsibilities, my wife and I both work full-time jobs, we're living a fast-paced, overwhelmed life, and the idea of purpose can sometimes seem almost out of reach. And even if it's within reach, it can almost seem like it's just, oh God, that's one more to do on my list, right? And so how do we start to make this something that doesn't feel like this big pie in the sky thing, but something that we can start to bring into our life through these tiny, tiny, everyday little rituals, which is, where I think we see so many people like the assembly line workers and the grocery store clerks that have been able to do that.
Absolutely. And that's why I think this book is so timely at a point in time when we are coming out of, 3 years ago. And for the next 2+ years, we were isolated. Many
Yeah.
of us, weren't able to connect with our loved ones or even ourselves as much as we did. Mental health crisis, racial injustice, unrest, political divisiveness. There are
Yeah.
so many things that seem to be getting in the way of us connecting with ourselves, right? And
Yeah.
the whole reason why we're here. So I love how the book is both there are many great stories, but also really practical as well. And I want to get to some of the practical
Sure.
tools that you share. But before I do, I'm really curious to know, what did you learn about yourself
Hmm.
going through this process?
Well, for me, I'd always sort of had this, idea that storytelling was at my essence. I've always enjoyed that. My very first paid job, outside of, working in restaurants, was writing speeches. And, to me, that was like, I knew that there was something there, but I had sort of abandoned that path. Like I'd gone to Silicon Valley as soon as I could. The iPhone had launched around the time, Callie, that you and I were getting to know each other. And, that was a world that was very alluring to me. But at the same time, I knew that I was sort of turning my back on this part of me that I really felt like I was. And so for me, there were the kind of these two different worlds. There was a world that I was in, and then there was a world that I sort of feel like I had, like, regrettably left behind. And the thing that this book really sort of taught me was that I don't have to necessarily jump back to that world in order to start integrating the things that make it special for me, right? So, the metaphor that I talk about in the book is that Dharma is not something that you have to go looking for. It's already inside of you. And it's like Michelangelo, who would look at a block of marble and he would say the sculpture is already inside. Right? All we have to do is really chisel away the layers and reveal this thing that has already been part of you. It's not a transformation as much as it is a liberation of this thing that has been wanting to speak, right? And so for me, realizing that I could start to do that even in little ways, right? When I started to think about this book, it was, I was working inside a technology company, and I had started my own. It was a seed funded company that did one-on-one health coaching. I was running a team, and I kind of started to realize that being like a tech founder was not my thing. I felt like it was the kind of thing that was a cool, like it was what the cool kids were doing. And I felt like I was living somebody else's dream. But when I started to kind of come back to my own and say, well, actually storytelling is the thing that you love to do, I didn't have the option at that point in time, to close the company, like get rid of everything that was on my plate. I still had a responsibility. I still had duties, and I had a family, and we were trying to figure things out ourselves and pay the bills. And so I had to continue down this path, but I started to figure out ways I could bring storytelling more and more, align it a little bit more into what I was doing on a daily basis. And for me, practically speaking, what that meant is spending more time with the customer stories. It meant spending more time telling and sharing those stories with my team. It meant doing some more speaking on stage, right? And sharing kind of what we were doing and telling the story around that to investors and to partners. And I started to come into my own as a CEO in a way that I never thought I would, purely through storytelling. So, you know, the message is that, like, essence, this thing that we're calling essence, it goes beneath the job title, right? It goes into something that, we sort of haven't been necessarily conditioned to think about. But when we can go there and understand what's that thing that goes beneath a job, we can start to figure out other ways to express that. Like, I'll just tell you, can I tell you the quick story about, so here's a quick example. One that might be really kind of relatable for anybody who's listening right now is, like, there was a project manager. Her name was Mila, and she was like pretty good at what she did, and she was working inside a big company, but really wanted to be a teacher. The problem was that she had two kids. Her family relied on her salary. They relied on her healthcare insurance, and she didn't have the liberty to necessarily quit her job and go become a teacher. And so, like a lot of us, I think she felt sort of this idea of being trapped. Like, she was in a path, she was working a job. The job felt like much more like a paycheck than it did a passion, but she kind of accepted it. And then one day she was with a mentor, and she sort of revealed this idea of, like, I wish that could go back in time and had become a teacher. I think I would have been a lot happier. And the mentor asked her a very, like, simple and yet profound question. She says, "What is it specifically about teaching that you love?" And Mila starts to answer that, and the mentor pushes her to go deeper, like, but get specific. What You go beneath the title, you go beneath, like, the benefits or anything like that, or the summer vacations off. Like, let's go into specifically day to day. What do you love about teaching? And as Mila went to that point, what she realized is that she really loved to help people grow. Like, that was her essence, right? And yes, teaching was one way to express that essence, but there are many others as well. And so she started to kind of explore these. And what she ended up doing was making a really small shift to another role, a training role inside her own company, inside her own department. But when that happened, everything changed. Like, she went from dreading her job to waking up with energy and enthusiasm. She becomes a rising star in the company. Her husband notices. Her kids see their mother come alive. And I think, again, it comes back to this myth that we have, that in order to live our purpose, we have to somehow blow up our life, right? In order to transform, our life, we have to blow up the way that we live. But not necessarily. I think the stories in this book and the examples in this book of everyday people who were able to find their way back into Dharma, I think shows us that we all have one. We all have something in us that wants to speak, and it is well within our reach.
Yes, yes. And I think so many people think about their purpose as this static thing that they need to figure out, and they spend their whole lives. I need to figure out my purpose.
Yes.
When I personally believe that it is the undercurrent in our lives. There is not one thing, there are so many ways that we can express that.
Yeah.
And I love that example, that where she was able to get to the core, the essence, her essence, what she really was compelled by, that can be expressed in so many different ways. Which that is, when I'm wearing my executive coach hat,
Mm.
that is what I love the most, is when, even not even only with executives, but when I'm coaching and I can help someone or help guide someone to see what that is for themselves. Oh my gosh, there's nothing like that.
Yeah.
There's nothing like that. I believe that there is no such thing as a failure,
Hmm.
that our lives have twists and turns, and there may be things and ways that we want to, there might be things that we want to happen in our lives a certain way, that when they don't go that way, we may feel disappointed.
Mm.
However, I personally believe that even in those times when those things happen, it's always for our greater good. One of the experiences that you had, that you talked about, was your journey running for Congress
Mm. Mhm.
and in your home state of Michigan. And the outcome of that race did not end the way you had hoped.
You're right.
Now that you have some distance, now that you've written this amazing book, which is not your first book, oh, by the way. So, this is not the first amazing book that you've written, but you've had some distance from that. What, how do you see that experience now?
Yeah.
And what do you think part of the purpose of that was for you personally?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there are certain sections of the book that I have to go back to and I have to remind myself of because I'm still working on it. I'm fascinated by Dharma. I'm fascinated by this body of wisdom that's been around and has helped so many people find purpose and happiness and joy in their everyday life. Sometimes I have to remind myself of these things as well. And the section that I think that I have sort of come around to the most is this idea of the magic of a missed goal. What can the profound things that can happen when you miss something? Because what you might find, and I think often do find, is that what happens after you miss that goal can sometimes actually lead to something even better. In my case, losing my election brought me back in many ways to who I was. I moved back to suburban Detroit, to that place where I used to cake baby powder onto my face as a kid. But after losing the election, I started to spend more time, at my local temple because I have two daughters and I wanted them to learn a little bit more about their culture. And so I started to come back to this place that I hadn't really visited since I was a child. And it was through that I started to kind of become much more connected to not only who I was, but to this body of wisdom called Dharma. And I never would have done that had I not run for office in the first place. It wouldn't have brought me to that place. It seems completely disconnected that a book on Dharma would be associated somehow with running for a political office, but it is. And the way that it is through, the world working in the strange way that it does. It's the magic of a missed goal. In the book, I talk about the art form of kintsugi, which I'm sure if you're listening, some of you have heard of this, but it's the art of golden repair. It came from 15th century Japan, where the one of the main figures out there had sort of broken his favorite mug, and he wanted it to be repaired, but they could not fix it. They could not get it back to the state it was in before. So they put golden lacquer in between the cracks to sort of make it something even better than what it was before. And that sort of art form called kintsugi didn't just become sort of a way of expressing art, but a way of expressing purpose, right? Which is that we also have a kintsugi for our heart. When the heart breaks, it also grows. You learn things along the way, and so I have come around to this idea of the magic, the profound magic of a missed goal. And the way that I sort of think about this now is that I used to live my life with the form of a map, right? And I think like many others, we get conditioned to this idea of we're going to do this and then that and then that and then that, right? And we sort of always have that last step in mind. But the problem is that sometimes it sort of blocks us from taking the first step if we don't know what the last step looks like. And so there's a lot of people out there that I know that want to go pursue things, or they have projects in mind, or they have goals in mind, whether that be a side hustle, whether that be a full-time career, but they won't do it because they don't have a clear vision of what that sort of final kind of point looks like. If anything, I think what this book has really taught me, and I think what I've seen other people sort of learn throughout the process, is to stop, treating their life like a map and to start treating it like a compass. And with the compass, you are simply figuring out what that right next step is. What is this thing that is really sort of calling me right now? And by the way, again, it doesn't need to be that you have to blow up where you are in order to take that next step, right? You can lower the bar and sort of take action, right? And that's your compass, and you move in that direction. And that once you take that step, you see where you are and you figure out what the next step is. And so, to me, it is probably one of the more liberating sort of ways for me to look at my life. I feel like once I started to treat it much more like a compass than a map, I started to do more, right? And the irony of all of it is that it wasn't doing more in the way that I was sort of brought up to do. I didn't have sort of these long-term goals. I didn't have this vision that I was waking up to do every day, where I was like, do or die, I must do this. It just became much more fascinating. I'm like, hey, I want to go learn this, or I want to go do this, right? And let me go put a fixed amount of time and effort into that. And once I hit that, we'll see where the next step takes me.
So good. So good. I love that analogy. Like it's not a map, it is a compass. And I've seen so many people get caught up in wanting to know all the steps.
Yeah.
And we know these people, we're surrounded by them. We're recovering, at least I am myself, wanting to know all the answers, right? Being used to knowing a lot of the path.
Mm.
And there is something I've learned to be said for taking a step back, having that goal in mind, that end goal, but just taking that next best step, then the next best step, then the next one. Because if we surrender to the good of the universe, then that actual path can be so much better
Yeah.
than whatever map we design for ourselves. So I think that illustrates your example, illustrates that so well.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, yeah.
Okay.
Well, one thing that I have been asked about a lot and I've been talking about a lot with the clients that I work with is burnout.
Hmm.
And so many people, leaders, everybody, like so many people are feeling burnt out. And I had been in the zone in doing this work, and in reading your book you were reinforcing so many things that I have been reading about the World Health Organization and classifying burnout as,
Yeah.
something that we need to be mindful of. And so many leaders are experiencing this. And I feel like a lot of people are so overwhelmed that they don't even know what to do to get out of it.
Yeah.
And you had some really practical steps. Can you share some of your favorite practical tools that people can incorporate into their everyday lives to either get out of this feeling of burnout or prevent it altogether?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, because, it's one thing to sort of, know your dharma, But even if you do know your Dharma, it's another thing to live it, right? And one of the things that takes us out of this place of purpose and energy is just exhaustion, right? We just get exhausted. And sometimes there's this belief that if you're doing something that you love, you're sort of immune from burnout, and that's just not true. A lot of what I do today is I speak to different organizations, but I'm on faculty at Harvard Medical School, and I talk to a lot of people who, are filled with purpose. They chose the path of medicine because they want to help people, and they feel really passionately about it, but they're also, burning out in a really big way. I'm about to go talk to, a consortium of nurses who, if you had to pick one thing right now in their lives, it's not a lack of purpose, it's just a lack of energy, like just burning out, right? And I think a lot of us, so many of us are feeling that way right now. One of the things that we see amongst the behavior traits of people who are able to sort of continue to have momentum in their lives, continue to have energy in their lives, is that they're taking frequent, focused, deliberate breaks every single day, right? They're not waiting for long weekends. They're not waiting for vacations in order to rest and recover. They're treating it as a daily practice. They're doing what I call rhythmic renewal, right? They're rhythmically renewing themselves day in and day out. In fact, the average high performer that we look at is seeing somewhere around 8 breaks every single day, right? Which, like, I know sounds extraordinary given like the world that we live in, right? It's like if you're if
Right.
you're if you're whether you're working from home, you're kind of clicking off of one link, clicking off onto another, or if you're back in person or hybrid, you're scrambling around, and it seems like that's happening more and more. It almost feels like as soon as we're done with one thing, we're already late for the next thing, right? So how do we start to kind of build this rhythm into our lives? And one of the ways that I sort of really I have been able to bring this into my life, into the other people's lives as well, is through what I call the 55-5 model, 55-5, which is that whenever possible, it's not always possible, whenever possible, for every 55 minutes of work, you're taking 5 minutes of focused, deliberate rest, right? And that 5 minutes can be spent doing anything. You could be sipping on a cup of coffee. You could be listening to music. You could be doing jumping jacks, push-ups, if that's your thing. Some people like to meditate. As long as it's deliberately non-productive, you're not trying to be productive. You're not trying to multitask during that time. And you might be sort of thinking, well, listen, I'm already kind of strapped for time. And now you're trying to convince me that I should shrink each hour by a few minutes. How is that going to help me? But what the science tells us is that that 5 minutes is going to make the other 55 minutes far more effective, far more creative, far more collaborative, far more energetic. All the things that we associate with high performance, you will get more of that in the other 55 minutes. When I bring the 55-5 model into practice with the people that I coach, teams I work with, leaders that I've been sort of, helping, one of the most common things that I hear is that for the first time ever, they're experiencing as much energy at the end of the day as they did at the beginning of the day, simply by taking these 5-minute recoveries throughout.
Wow. And it's counterproductive or counterintuitive.
Yeah.
And definitely not counterproductive.
Yeah,
But,
no, it's definitely
but
counterintuitive, right? Because you're shrinking your amount of
yeah.
time. But like
Yes.
one of the things that I am constantly sort of stunned by is when you read, you get into the research around where we come up with our best ideas, right? Like Michael Gelb, who is a famous researcher, did a lot of work around this, and he surveyed tens of thousands of people on like, where do you come up with your best work? If you look back on that moment in your career where you came up with the idea for your team, or the idea for your company, or the idea for your nonprofit, where were you? What happened? And what he found is that the range of those environments was like, I was walking in nature, or I was with my kids, or I was in the shower, or I was driving. Almost nobody answered at my desk. Right. And
Isn't that
so,
interesting?
yeah, it really, really is. Right. And
Mhm.
so this intentional, non-productive time feels in a lot of ways like it's rubbing against everything that we're being trained to do right now. Because right now, it's all about squeezing every ounce of productivity out of every minute of every day, right? But what we're losing with that mentality are these truly creative, liberated moments. And we're missing the fact that when we can put ourselves in that state, we come up with the ideas, we come up with the creativity that end up truly making the biggest difference. And I forgot the artist's name who said this, but he said, like, an artist's job is not to make art. An artist's job is to create an environment where art is inevitable, right? And by squeezing productivity out of every minute, what we're doing is we're shutting that door. We're sort of saying we're going to create environments where maybe things get done, but we're not actually opening the window for creative, inspirational things that can make the biggest difference, not only in our lives, but in other people's as well.
Absolutely. That chapter made me think, and also I believe there was a TED Talk that you referenced as well. It made me think about when I was 25 years old, I was working in consulting for one of the big consulting companies, and my creativity was so
Mm,
repressed
mm.
that that year when I was 25, I wrote 75 songs. I taught
Wow.
myself to oil paint. I had
Wow.
all of these ideas, and a lot of my ideas came from when I was driving. So
Wow.
I would drive, and sometimes an hour to a client site. I'd be in that mental meditative state. This was way before, podcasts were a thing. And I would get in that frame of mind and I would have all of these creative ideas. And to
Mm,
this day, in the shower, I get these ideas. I was talking to a friend of mine last week, and she was saying she was working on her first book and she went to a writer's retreat in New Mexico.
mm,
And she said, I didn't realize how important it was to have time when I wasn't productive
mm,
because I'm getting inspiration during the week, but I just don't have the time to capture it, to sit down and really process it.
mm.
And so I think that is such an important topic.
Yeah, yeah. Good, good.
Yeah, yeah. No, I wanted to mention if anybody has any questions for Suneel, please put them in the chat. We'll try to get to as many as we can. If you have any that are burning, one question that I have for you, Suneel, is what is your greatest desire with
Mm.
this book? What would make you writing this book feel fulfilling to you in your Dharma?
Great question. My greatest desire is that when my daughter, who's 11 years old, I have two daughters, but one is going to graduate from high school and probably leave the house earlier than the other. And I just imagine handing this book to her. I imagine when she leaves, like, there are going to be a few things that I'm gonna hand to her, and I want this book to be one of them. And it contains the stories of her ancestors. It contains the stories of this way of living that, even though she's not connected to necessarily in the way that I was, she didn't sit on a porch in New Delhi with my grandfather the way that I did and learn about Dharma. It's something that I hope that you know she can get some value in. And I think that ultimately, there is there's a metaphor that I talk about in the book, and this is what my Bauji, my grandfather, passed on to me. Is he saw the world as sort of almost like a massive sitar. A sitar is like a string. It's an Indian string instrument, and what he said is that, like, each of us represents a string. You, Kylie, represent the string. I represent the string. Anybody who's listening right now, we're all one string, right? And the best thing that we can do is really sort of play our string, right? To go further into who we are and to start to express that to the world. When we do that, we start to play our string. But what's wonderful about that is when we play our string, we also bring everybody around us just a little bit more into harmony as well, right? That if I had to give my daughters one thing, it would be that. It would be, how do we tune into our own string? How do we play that in a more profound way? And this book, the way that I saw it was I hand it to you when you go to college because it is a series of rituals of everyday things that we can do to start to learn how to play our own string.
That's beautiful. That is beautiful. What a gift. What a gift. And I'm imagining not only you giving this to your daughter and your daughters, but other parents giving this to theirs as well. So beautiful. Well, Suneel, we are now to the point in the conversation. I have some questions. I have some questions for you.
Yeah.
I have some questions to get to know you a little bit better. This is our speed round that we
Okay.
call the final five.
I'm always, I'm
And
always,
so,
wor- I'm always. This is always the nervous. Like I've seen you do this before. It's fun to watch
don't
you. It's
be.
it's fun to watch you, Kylie, do this to other people. And then now that I'm in the hot seat, I'm like, maybe this isn't.
No need to be scared, Sunil. No need to be scared. This is going to be easy breezy. And I'm really looking forward to learning a little bit more about you through this too.
Okay.
So I'm going to ask you the final five, and then we have a question that came through the chat that I'll come back to ask, and then we'll wrap up.
Okay.
So I would love for you to pick five numbers between the numbers of 1 and 22.
All right. Here we go. 3,
Mhm.
7, 12, 17, and we'll go with 21.
All right. First question. What was your first job? So the first job you got paid for.
So I was a busboy, Salvatore Scalapini's of Novi, Italian restaurant. Only manufactured ingredients, nothing fresh inside the restaurant. I worked my way up started out as pasta boy, where I would make pasta, and worked my way up to waiter and eventually to host of the restaurant.
Wow, look at you. Impressive there.
Eh,
Learn something new. Learn something new.
Totally.
The, the next question is, what is one book that has impacted your life the most?
I would say The Alchemist. The Alchemist is a fable, from Paulo Coelho, and it's one of those books that I think it's first of all, it's a very simple read. It's a very you can read it in a few hours, and it is just it's transportive. That's how I would describe it. You do feel like you're in a different world, and you are, but to be able to take a reader there is a special art form. And I think that when I look at sort of my own writing and I'm trying to figure out in its best, purest form, what do I want it to feel like? I always come back to The Alchemist.
Such a classic, one of my favorites as well. Love, love, love that book.
Yeah.
So the next question is, who is someone you like really admire?
Mm,
Somebody who you absolutely adore, look up to.
mm.
Who's that person for you, or one of those people for you?
The person who's top of mind for me right now is Bob Marley.
Mm.
I spent a lot of time researching and reading about Bob Marley for this book, and I love his music, of course. And there was always a spirit and a vibe to Bob Marley that I always sort of just it made me happy. And I also feel like sometimes happy music, like or music that sort of has a good vibe to it, is often not saying very much. It's not very deep, but to be both sort of, like have a really nice, good vibe to it, but at the same time be saying something is not an easy balance to strike. And I think Bob Marley probably struck it better than anyone that I know or anyone I've heard. Um,
Yes.
but I also think that he was a poet, and I think that when I started to watch his offstage interviews, I didn't realize how profound he really was about the philosophy of life. One of my favorite quotes from Bob Marley is that the day you stop racing is the day you win the race. And I love that because I don't think what he was saying is that you shouldn't have ambition in life or that you shouldn't want things or that you shouldn't create things because clearly he did all of those. But I think what he was saying is that, you know, I think I sort of identified even better than I did through, a couple hundred pages in my book is that there is a difference between outer success and inner success, right? And we can spend our whole life racing and chasing outer success, but no matter how much we get, it's not necessarily going to lead us to this feeling of inner success, which is much more about purpose and meaning and joy. And once you can start to reverse the flow, once you can actually start to do things that have meaning for you, or even to align it just a little bit more, bring more of who you are to what you do, not only does that sort of fill your cup on a day-to-day basis, but I think ultimately it sort of ends up leading to more outer success as well.
Absolutely. So profound. Second to last question is, what is your favorite movie?
Gosh, all time. I love The Graduate. The Graduate, I just think is like just a classic, like, and I think like I've always identified with Dustin Hoffman's character in The Graduate because he's just like, he sort of just doesn't know what he's doing. Right. I've always felt that way. I think even as a writer, one of the best pieces of advice I got from another writer was, you don't necessarily have to write about what you know, but you have to write about what you want to know, right? If you are deeply, deeply curious about something, that I think is the essential ingredient for writing a book, right? And I'm always that person. Like, I never know what I'm doing. And even with my last book, which was all about sort of, if you have ideas, how do you get other people to believe in those ideas? I was not good at that, but I had such a fascination for people who were, and I wanted to understand what it took to, craft an idea in a way that really made it in, something that people wanted to get behind. And so I studied everybody that I could who was exceptional at that, and I wrote a book on it. And the same thing is true for Dharma. I'm not a guru in any way, and I struggle with this stuff just as much as anybody else does, but I have such a deep sense of curiosity for who was able to overcome the barriers, who was able to realize that their life was going off track and able to bring it back through these very simple sort of daily rituals that, I could channel that curiosity into a book. And I think, Dustin Hoffman's character in The Graduate, it reminds me a lot of that type of that approach too.
So good. So good. Our last quick fire is, we are all weird in certain ways. I believe we are all weird
Yes.
in certain ways. So what is your flavor of weird? Like, what is one way in which you feel like, yeah, I might be a little weird, like, because of this?
Oh my gosh. I mean, first of all, such a great question. If my kids were here right now, they would rattle off like 30. But I have really become like anti-phone to a point that really drives like my family really nuts. I'm just so liberated by like walking around with a little pad of paper, sometimes like literally a post-it, like and like just a pen, right? So like a stack of post-its and a pen. And so there will be times where you'll see me, if you were to run into each other, where you'll literally just see me like reaching into my pocket and like pulling out like a little post-it pad and just like writing notes. And I'm constantly doing that. And now I think like my neighbors have seen that enough that they're kind of like trying to figure out what this guy's all about. Like, what is he like studying the landscape and like making notes about like different like points of geography? I don't like, no one knows what my deal is. But there have also been times when like my family's like, dude, we've been trying to get in touch with you. Like, you have to take your phone because we don't know where you are. And I try to like wander sometimes, and I find it so just liberating to be phoneless. So like, if I can make like one suggestion, like, it like, for if you haven't done that in a while, like, go take a walk and leave your phone behind. It'll feel very weird and yet at the same time very liberating.
I'm doing that this week.
Nice. Nice.
I love it. Well, we have some questions. I'm going to combine one in the interest of time. So it'll be a two-part.
Okay.
One is, how do you prioritize your self-care And this person was asking in the context of also modeling for your daughters,
Mm.
what does that look like for you? And then also, we can read this fantastic book, get all of these tools, but if we get back into our same patterns, how do we overcome going back to our default
Mm.
as we're taking all of this in?
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so let's start with number one, and maybe you might have to remind me of number two. So number one is really about sort of how do I model this for my daughters and self-care. And so I've gotten really serious about the idea of transitions in between things. So, finding some space in between the things that I do to come back to myself, even if it literally is putting my hand on my chest and taking a few breaths. Yeah, that is a transition between, what I'm doing in this moment and what I'm about to do in sort of my next thing. And I think that to me, more than anything else, is a really sort of important thing for my daughters, because things are continuing to move faster and faster and faster. I mean, the other day, my daughter asked me, "Hey, listen, there are a couple kids on the playground that are like kind of bullying me right now. And so what do I do?" And we talked through a few things, but one of the things that really stuck with her is, after that recess or after that moment, taking like a little bit of time to give herself some self-love, right? To just give her, like, whether it's a hand on the chest and a few breaths, even just like, I find, this is another sort of like Suneel weird thing, but like even just like running your hands over your cheeks a little bit can be a very sort of gentle thing that you can do for yourself. And it provides a little bit of transition, in between this thing that you're doing right now and that thing that you're about to do. The mindset shift that I want to create for myself, and I think for others, including my daughters, is that this idea of rest is something that we have to earn, right? That's kind of how we've been conditioned. We have to earn rest, and if we can shift from this idea that we have to treat rest as something that is a reward for something that we just did, and instead think of it as more of a preparation for what we are about to do, that I think alone can be, one of the most rewarding things that I can model for them. So they see me taking these moments all the time. And in a perfect world, it's the 55-5 model. If I've got that full 5 minutes of rest, sometimes I don't, right? I'm going from one partnership meeting to another, and I have to, but what they will always see me do is, even if I'm going to run like 1 minute late, they'll see me put my hand on my heart. They'll see me do something to transition myself from one period to the next one. And then
That's
the
a good
second,
one.
and then this,
Mhm.
sorry, and then remind me again, the second part.
So the second one was, how do we keep this going?
Yeah.
How do we keep this going when our default behavior wants to creep in?
I think the most important thing when it comes to keeping things going is to start small, right? And I think that's one of the things that I know I have made the mistake of before, is in thinking that when I want to make a change in my life, it's got to be completely wholesale all at once. But the way that this book is really broken up is into these tiny rituals, these tiny things that we can start to kind of implement, right? And we can take it slow. And I think that the the power of that is extraordinary. When I was, running my tech company, we were doing one-on-one health coaching, right? And so people would come to us when they were at a period in their lives when they needed to make a change in their health behaviors. And typically it was because they were at risk for diabetes or heart disease, and they had tried other diets. But what we did is we would match you with your own personal health coach, which was very effective. And we would do it right over your mobile phone. When people would come to us, typically they had tried things, like they'd gone paleo, right, for a while. Like, that was a very common story, where they had tried a wholesale diet. They'd sort of like ripped off the band-aid, done it all at once. And what we found almost in all cases is that they got results pretty quickly, but then they very rarely were able to keep those results. They ended up sort of rebounding back to where they were before, right? And so the frustration was, I need to lose weight, but I also need to keep it off. How do I do that? And the way that we were able to, I think, help so many people was through really, really small changes, really, really small things. But critically, they were through what I now call in the book high quality habits. And a high quality habit is something that is good for you, but is also something that you want to keep doing. It has to be, because if it's something that you don't want to keep doing, like you go paleo and you love carbs, then every day turns into a slog. It might be effective for the short term, but it's a low quality habit because you're not going to want to continue it over time. So finding little things that really reach you and to a point where you're like, not only can I do that, but I can embrace it. Right? Kevin Kelly, who was the founder of Wired, said, we spend so much of our lives trying to figure out how to do tasks better, but we don't spend enough time in our lives trying to figure out tasks that we never want to stop doing, right? Because we really love it. And that's the best way to start aligning yourself with your dharma, is to start picking these one or two things that you want to start bringing into your life in a really slow way. And it might sound small, but the fact is that every time you align yourself just a little bit more with who you are, and you start to express that just a little bit more to the outside, even that 1 inch of alignment can make a huge difference. You will start to feel yourself breathing a little bit easier. You'll start to feel yourself inspiring the people around you. You'll start to feel yourself coming into your own and coming alive in a brand new way just through these little changes.
A perfect way to end our conversation. Suneel, thank you for your generosity with your wisdom, your time, your research, this capital W work that you're putting out in the world. I am so thankful that you have lost and found your Dharma.
Mm.
And most importantly, that you are teaching us to do the same. So, everybody, Everyday Dharma in stores now. Make sure you get yourself a copy or two or three and purchase some for your loved ones as well. Great gift idea. The holidays will be coming up soon. I'm just saying. So, Suneel, thank you, friend. Thank you so
Kylie,
much.
it was so great to reconnect with you. Thanks, Kylie.
Thank you. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. Take care.